This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea Fairies by L. Frank Baum, Chapter 17, The Queen's Golden Sword. "Goodness me!" exclaimed Trot, raising herself by a flirt of her pink-scaled tail and a wave of her fins. "Isn't it dreadful hot here?" The mermaids had risen at the same time, and Cap'n Bill came swimming in from the peony room in time to hear the little girl's speech. "Hot?" echoed the sailor. "Why, I feel like the inside of a steam engine." The perspiration was rolling down his round red face, and he took out his handkerchief and carefully wiped it away, waving his fishtail gently at the same time. "What we need most in this room," said he, "is a fan." "What's the matter, do you suppose?" inquired Trot. "It is another trick of the monster Zog," answered the Queen calmly. "He has made the water in our rooms boiling hot, and if it could touch us, we would be well cooked by this time. Even as it is, we are all made uncomfortable by breathing the heated air." "What shall we do, ma'am?" the sailor man asked with a groan. "I expected to get into hot water afore we've done with this foolishness, but I don't like the feel of bein' parboiled just the same." The Queen was waving her fairy wand and paid no attention to Cap'n Bill's moans. Already the water felt cooler and they began to breathe more easily. In a few moments more, the heat had passed from the surrounding water altogether, and all danger from this source was over. "This is better," said Trot gratefully. "Do you care to sleep again?" asked the Queen. "No, I'm wide awake now," answered the child. "I'm afraid if I goes to sleep again, I'll wake up a pot roast," said Cap'n Bill. "Let us consider ways to escape," suggested Clia. "It seems useless for us to remain here quietly until Zog discovers a way to destroy us." "But we must not blunder," added Aquareine cautiously. "To fail in our attempt would be to acknowledge Zog's superior power, so we must think well upon our plan before we begin to carry it out. What do you advise, sir?" she asked, turning to Cap'n Bill. "My opinion, ma'am, is that the only way for us to escape is to get out of here," was the sailor's vague answer. "How to do it is your business, seein' as I ain't no fairy myself, either in looks or in edication." The Queen smiled and said to Trot, "What is your opinion, my dear?" "I think we might swim out the same way we came in," answered the child. "If we could get Sacho to lead us back through the maze, we would follow that long tunnel to the open ocean and there would be the sea devils waitin' for us," added Cap'n Bill with a shake of his bald head. "They'd drive us back inter the tunnel like they did the first time, Trot. It won't do, mate. It won't do." "Have you a suggestion, Clia?" inquired the Queen. "I have thought of an undertaking," replied the pretty princess. "But it is a bold plan, your Majesty, and you may not care to risk it." "Let us hear it anyway," said Aquareine encouragingly. "It is to destroy Zog himself and put him out of the world forever. Then we would be free to go home whenever we pleased." "Can you suggest a way to destroy Zog?" asked Aquareine. "No, your Majesty," Clia answered. "I must leave the way for you to determine." "In the old days," said the Queen thoughtfully, "the mighty Kingenko could not destroy this monster. He succeeded in defeating Zog and drove him into this great cavern, but even Enko could not destroy him." "I have heard the sea serpent explain that it was because he could not reach the magician," returned Clia. "If King Enko could have seized Zog in his coils, he would have made an end of the wicked monster quickly. Zog knows this, and that is why he does not dare to venture forth from his retreat. Enko is the enemy he constantly dreads. But with you, my queen, the case is different. You may easily reach Zog, and the only question is whether your power is sufficient to destroy him." For a while, Aquareine remained silent. "I am not sure of my power over Zog," she said at last, "and for that reason I hesitate to attack him personally. His slaves and his allies, the sea devils, I can easily conquer, so I prefer to find a way to overcome the guards at the entrances rather than to encounter their terrible master. But even the guards have been given strength and power by the magician, as we have already discovered, so I must procure a weapon with which to fight them." "A weapon, ma'am?" said Cap'n Bill. And then he took a jackknife from his coat pocket and opened the big blade, afterward handing it to the queen. "That ain't a bad weapon," he announced. "But it is useless in this case," she replied, smiling at the old sailor's earnestness. "For my purpose, I must have a golden sword." "Well, there's plenty of gold around this castle," said Trot, looking around her. "Even in this room, there's enough to make 100 golden swords." "But we can't melt or forge gold under water, mate," the captain said. "Why not? Don't you suppose all these gold roses and things were made under water?" asked the little girl. "Like enough," admitted the sailor, "but I don't see how." Just then the gong at their door sounded, and the boy Sacho came in, smiling and cheerful as ever. He said Zog had sent him to inquire after their health and happiness. "You may tell him that his water became a trifle too warm, so we cooled it," replied the queen. Then they told Sacho how the boiling water had made them uncomfortable while they slept. Sacho whistled a little tune and seemed thoughtful. "Zog is foolish," said he. "How often have I told him that vengeance is but a waste of time? He is worried to know how to destroy you, and that is wasting more time. You are worried for fear he will injure you, and so you also are wasting time. My, what a waste of time is going on in this castle." "Seems to me that we have so much time it doesn't matter," said Trot. "What's time for, anyhow?" "Time is given us to be happy and for no other reason," replied the boy soberly. "When we waste time, we waste happiness. But there is no time for preaching, so I'll go." "Please wait a moment, Sacho," said the queen. "Can I do anything to make you happy?" he asked, smiling again. "Yes," answered Aquareine. "We are curious to know who does all this beautiful gold work and ornamentation." "Some of the slaves here are goldsmiths, having been taught by Zog to forge and work metal under water," explained Sacho. "In parts of the ocean lie many rocks filled with veins of pure gold and golden nuggets, and we get large supplies from sunken ships as well. There is no lack of gold here, but it is not as precious as it is upon the earth, because here we have no need of money." "We would like to see the goldsmiths at work," announced the queen. The boy hesitated a moment. Then he said, "I will take you to their room, where you may watch them for a time. I will not ask Zog's permission to do this, for he might refuse. But my orders were to allow you the liberty of the castle, and so I will let you see the goldsmith's shop." "Thank you," replied Aquareine quietly, and then the four followed Sacho along various corridors until they came to a large room where a dozen men were busily at work. The shop was flooded with the brilliant unknown light. Lying here and there were heaps of virgin gold, some of it in its natural state, and some already fashioned into ornaments and furniture of various sorts. Each man worked at a bench where there was a curious iron furnace in which glowed a vivid white light. Although this workshop was all under water and the workmen were obliged to breathe as fishes do, the furnaces glowed so hot that the water touching them was turned into steam. Gold or other metal held over a furnace quickly softened or melted when it could be forged or molded into any shape desired. "The furnaces are electric," explained Sacho, "and heat as well under water as they would in the open air. Let me introduce you to the foreman, who will tell you of his work better than I can." The foreman was a slave named Agagru, who was lean and lank and had an expression more surly and unhappy than any slave they had yet seen. Yet he seemed willing to leave his work and explain to the visitors how he made so many beautiful things out of gold, for he took much pride in this labor and knew its artistic worth. Moreover, since he had been in Zog's castle, these were the first strangers to enter his workshop, so he welcomed them in his own gruff way. The queen asked him if he was happy, and he shook his head and replied, "It isn't like Calcutta, where I used to work in gold before I was wrecked at sea and nearly drowned. Zog rescued me and brought me here a slave. It is a stupid life we lead, doing the same things over and over every day, but perhaps it is better than being dead. I'm not sure. The only pleasure I get in life is in creating pretty things out of gold." "Could you forge me a golden sword?" asked the queen, smiling sweetly upon the goldsmith. "I could, madam, but I won't unless Zog orders me to do it." Do you like Zog better than you do me?" inquired Aquareine. "No," was the answer. "I hate Zog." "Then won't you make the sword to please me and to show your skill?" pleaded the pretty mermaid. "I'm afraid of my master. He might not like it," the man replied. "But he will never know," said Princess Clia. "You cannot say what Zog knows or what he doesn't know," growled the man. "I can't take chances of offending Zog, for I must live with him always as a slave." With this, he turned away and resumed his work, hammering the leaf of a golden tulip. Cap'n Bill had listened carefully to this conversation, and being a wise old sailor in his way, he thought he understood the nature of old Agga Groo better than the mermaids did. So he went close to the goldsmith and, feeling in his pockets of his coat, drew out a silver compass shaped like a watch. "I'll give you this if you make the queen the golden sword," he said. Agga Groo looked at the compass with interest and tested its power of pointing north. Then he shook his head and handed it back to Cap'n Bill. The sailor dived into his pocket again and pulled out a pair of scissors, which he placed beside the compass on the palm of his big hand. "You may have them both," he said. Agga Groo hesitated, for he wanted the scissors badly, but finally he shook his head again. Cap'n Bill added a piece of cord, an iron thimble, some fish hooks, 4 buttons, and a safety pin, but still the goldsmith would not be tempted. So with a sigh, the sailor brought out his fine big jackknife, and at sight of this, Agga Groo's eyes began to sparkle. Steel was not to be had at the bottom of the sea, although gold was so plentiful. "All right, friend," he said. "Give me that lot of trinkets, and I'll make you a pretty gold sword. But it won't be any good except to look at, for our gold is so pure that it is very soft." "Never mind that," replied Cap'n Bill. "All we want is the sword." The goldsmith set to work at once, and so skillful was he that in a few minutes he had forged a fine sword of yellow gold with an ornamental handle. The shape was graceful and the blade keen and slender. It was evident to them all that the golden sword would not stand hard use, for the edge of the blade would nick and curl like lead, but the queen was delighted with the prize and took it eagerly in her hand. Just then Sacco returned to say that they must go back to their rooms, and after thanking the goldsmith, who was so busy examining his newly acquired treasures that he made no response, they joyfully followed the boy back to the rose chamber. Sacco told them that he had just come from Zog, who was still wasting time in plotting vengeance. "You must be careful," he advised them, "for my cruel master intends to stop you from living, and he may succeed. Don't be unhappy, but be careful. Zog is angry because you escaped his Yell Maker, and the falling stones, and the hot water. While he is angry, he is wasting time, but that will not help you. Take care not to waste any time yourselves." "Do you know what Zog intends to do to us next?" asked Princess Clia. "No," said Sacco, "but it is reasonable to guess that being evil, he intends evil. He never intends to do good, I assure you." Then the boy went away. "I am no longer afraid," declared the Mermaid Queen when they were alone. "When I have bestowed certain fairy powers upon this golden sword, it will fight its way against any who dare oppose us, and even Zog himself will not care to face so powerful a weapon. I am now able to promise you that we shall make our escape." "Good!" cried Trot joyfully. "Shall we start now?" "Not yet, my dear. It will take me a little while to charm this golden blade so that it will obey my commands and do my work. There is no need of undue haste, so I propose we all sleep for a time and obtain what rest we can. We must be fresh and ready for our great adventure." As their former nap had been interrupted, they readily agreed to Aquarine's proposal and at once went to their couches and composed themselves to slumber. While they were asleep, the fairy mermaid charmed her golden sword, and then she also lay down to rest herself. End of chapter 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea Fairies by L. Frank Baum, Chapter 18, A Dash for Liberty. Trot dreamed that she was at home in her own bed, but the night seemed chilly and she wanted to draw the coverlet up to her chin. She was not wide awake, but realized that she was cold and was unable to move her arms to cover herself up. She tried but could not stir. Then she roused herself a little more and tried again. Yes, it was cold, very cold. Really, she must do something to get warm, she thought. She opened her eyes and stared at a great wall of ice in front of her. She was awake now and frightened too, but she could not move because the ice was all around her. She was frozen inside of it, and the airspace around her was not big enough to allow her to turn over. At once the little girl realized what had happened. Their wicked enemy Zog had, by his magic art, frozen all the water in their room while they slept, and now they were all imprisoned and helpless. Trot and Cap'n Bill were sure to freeze to death in a short time, for only a tiny air space remained between their bodies and the ice, and this air was like that of a winter day when the thermometer is below zero. Across the room, Trot could see the Mermaid Queen lying on her couch, for the solid ice was clear as crystal. Aquareine was imprisoned just as Trot was, and although she held her fairy wand in one hand and the golden sword in the other, she seemed unable to move either of them, and the girl remembered that the queen always waved her magic wand to accomplish anything. Princess Clea's couch was behind that of Trot, so the girl could not see her, and Cap'n Bill was in his own room, probably frozen fast in the ice as the others were. The terrible Zog had surely been very clever in this last attempt to destroy them. Trot thought it all over and decided that, inasmuch as the queen was unable to wave her fairy wand, she could do nothing to release herself or her friends. But in this the girl was mistaken. The fairy mermaid was even now at work trying to save them, and in a few minutes Trot was astonished and delighted to see the queen rise from her couch. She could not go far from it at first, but the ice was melting rapidly all around her, so that gradually Aquareine approached the place where the child lay. Trot could hear the mermaid's voice sounding through the ice as if from afar off, but it grew more distinct until she could make out that the queen was saying, "Courage, friends! Do not despair, for soon you will be free." Before very long, the ice between Trot and the queen had melted away entirely, and with a cry of joy, the little girl flopped her pink tail and swam to the side of her deliverer. "Are you very cold?" asked Aquareine. "Not very," replied Trot, but her teeth chattered and she was still shivering. "The water will be warm in a few minutes," said the queen, "but now I must melt the rest of the ice and liberate Clea." This she did in an astonishingly brief time, and the pretty princess, being herself a fairy, had not been at all affected by the cold surrounding her. They now swam to the door of Cap'n Bill's room and found the peony chamber a solid block of ice. The queen worked her magic power as hard as she could, and the ice thawed and melted quickly before her fairy wand. Yet when they reached the old sailor, he was almost frozen stiff, and Trot and Clea had to rub his hands and nose and ears very briskly to warm him up and bring him back to life. Cap'n Bill was pretty tough, and he came around in time and opened his eyes and sneezed and asked if the blizzard was over. So the queen waved her wand over his head a few times to restore him to his natural condition of warmth, and soon the old sailor became quite comfortable and was able to understand all about the strange adventure from which he had so marvelously escaped. "I've made up my mind to one thing, Trot," he said confidentially. "If ever I get out of this mess I'm in, I won't be an Arctic explorer, whatever else happens. Shivers and shakes ain't to my likin', and this ice business ain't what it's sometimes cracked up to be. To be friz once is enough for anybody, and if I was a gal like you, I wouldn't even wear frizzes in my hair." "You haven't any hair," Cap'n Bill answered Trot, "so you needn't worry." The queen and Clea had been talking together very earnestly. They now approached their earth friends, and Aquareine said, "We have decided not to remain in this castle any longer. Zog's cruel designs upon our lives and happiness are becoming too dangerous for us to endure. The golden sword now bears a fairy charm, and by its aid I will cut a way through our enemies. Are you ready and willing to follow me?" "Of course we are!" cried Trot. "It don't seem 'zactly right to ask a lady to do the fightin'," remarked Cap'n Bill, "but magic ain't my strong point, and it seems to be yours, ma'am. So swim ahead, and we'll wiggle the same way you do, and try to wiggle out of our troubles." "If I chance to fail," said the Queen, "try not to blame me. I will do all in my power to provide for our escape, and I am willing to risk everything, because I well know that to remain here will mean to perish in the end." "That's all right," said Trot with fine courage. "Let's have it over with." "Then we will leave here at once," said Aquareine. She approached the window of the room and with one blow of her golden sword shattered the thick pane of glass. The opening thus made was large enough for them to swim through if they were careful not to scrape against the broken points of glass. The Queen went first, followed by Trot and Cap'n Bill, with Clia last of all. And now they were in the vast dome in which the castle and gardens of Zog had been built. Around them was a clear stretch of water, and far above, full half a mile distant, was the opening in the roof guarded by the Prince of the Sea Devils. The Mermaid Queen had determined to attack this monster. If she succeeded in destroying it with her golden sword, the little band of fugitives might then swim through the opening into the clear waters of the ocean. Although this Prince of the Sea Devils was said to be big and wise and mighty, there was but one of him to fight, whereas if they attempted to escape through any of the passages, they must encounter scores of such enemies. "Swim straight for the opening in the dome!" cried Aquareine, and in answer to the command, the four whisked their glittering tails, waved their fins, and shot away through the water at full speed, their course slanting upward toward the top of the dome. End of chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sea Fairies by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 19. Kingenko comes to the rescue. The great magician Zog never slept. He was always watchful and alert. Some strange power warned him that his prisoners were about to escape. Scarcely had the four left the castle by the broken window when the monster stepped from a doorway below and saw them. Instantly he blew upon a golden whistle, and at the summons a band of wolf-fish appeared and dashed after the prisoners. These creatures swam so swiftly that soon they were between the fugitives and the dome, and then they turned and with wicked eyes and sharp fangs began a fierce attack upon the mermaids and the earth dwellers. Trot was a little frightened at the evil looks of the sea wolves, whose heads were enormous and whose jaws contained rows of curved and pointed teeth. But Aquareine advanced upon them with her golden sword, and every touch of the charmed weapon instantly killed an enemy, so that one by one the wolf-fish rolled over upon their backs and sank helplessly downward through the water, leaving the prisoners free to continue their way toward the opening in the dome. Zog witnessed the destruction of his wolves and uttered a loud laugh that was terrible to hear. Then the dread monster determined to arrest the fugitives himself, and in order to do this, he was forced to discover himself in all the horror of his awful form, a form he was so ashamed of and loathed so greatly that he always strove to keep it concealed even from his own eyes. But it was important that his prisoners should not escape. Hastily casting off the folds of the robe that enveloped him, Zog allowed his body to uncoil and shoot upward through the water in swift pursuit of his victims. His cloven hoofs, upon which he usually walked, being now useless, were drawn up under him, while coil after coil of his eel-like body wriggled away like a serpent. At his shoulders, two broad feathery wings expanded, and these enabled the monster to cleave his way through the water with terrific force. Zog was part man, part beast, part fish, part fowl, and part reptile. His undulating body was broad and thin and like the body of an eel. It was as repulsive as one could well imagine, and no wonder Zog hated it and kept it covered with his robe. Now with his horned head and its glowing eyes thrust forward, wings flapping from his shoulders, and his eely body ending in a fish's tail wriggling far behind him, this strange and evil creature was a thing of terror, even to the sea dwellers who were accustomed to remarkable sights. The mermaids, the sailor, and the child, one after another, looking back as they swam onward toward liberty and safety, saw the monster coming and shuddered with uncontrollable fear. They were drawing nearer to the dome by this time, yet it was still some distance away. The four redoubled their speed, darting through the water with the swiftness of skyrockets. But fast as they swam, Zog swam faster, and the good queen's heart began to throb as she realized she would be forced to fight her loathsome foe. Presently, Zog's long body was circling round them like a whirlwind, lashing the water into foam and gradually drawing nearer and nearer to his victims. His eyes were no longer glowing coals, they were balls of flame, and as he circled around them, he laughed aloud that horrible laugh, which was far more terrifying than any cry of rage could be. The queen struck out with her golden sword, but Zog wrapped a coil of his thin body around it, and wresting it from her hand, crushed the weapon into a shapeless mass. Then Aquareine waved her fairy wand, but in a flash the monster sent it flying away through the water. Cap'n Bill now decided that they were lost. He drew Trot closer to his side and placed one arm around her. "I can't save you, dear little mate," he said sadly, "but we've lived a long time together, and now we'll die together. I knew, Trot, when first we saw them mermaids, as we'd never live to tell the tale," said the child. "But never mind, Cap'n Bill. We've done the best we could, and we've had a fine time." "Forgive me, oh, forgive me!" cried Aquareine despairingly. "I tried to save you, my poor friends, but—" "What's that?" exclaimed the princess, pointing upward. They all looked past Zog's whirling body, which was slowly enveloping them in its folds, toward the round opening in the dome. A dark object had appeared there, sliding downward like a huge rope and descending toward them with lightning rapidity. They gave a great gasp as they recognized the countenance of Kingenko, the sea serpent, its gray hair and whiskers bristling like those of an angry cat, and the usually mild blue eyes glowing with a ferocity even more terrifying than the orbs of Zog. The magician gave a shrill scream at the sight of his dreaded enemy, and abandoning his intended victims, Zog made a quick dash to escape. But nothing in the sea could equal the strength and quickness of Kingenko when he was roused. In a flash, the sea serpent had caught Zog fast in his coils, and his mighty body swept round the monster and imprisoned him tightly. The four, so suddenly rescued, swam away to a safer distance from the struggle, and then they turned to watch the encounter between the two great opposing powers of the ocean's depths. Yet there was no desperate fight to observe, for the combatants were unequal. The end came before they were aware of it. Zog had been taken by surprise, and his great fear of Enko destroyed all of his magic power. When the sea serpent slowly released those awful coils, a mass of jelly-like pulp floated downward through the water, with no remnant of life remaining in it, no form to show it had once been Zog the magician. Then Enko shook his body that the water might cleanse it, and advanced his head toward the group of four whom he had so opportunely rescued. "It's all over, friends," said he in his gentle tones, while a mild expression once more reigned on his comical features. "You may go home at any time you please, for the way through the dome will be open as soon as I get my own body through it." Indeed, so amazing was the length of the great sea serpent that only a part of him had descended through the hole into the dome. Without waiting for the thanks of those he had rescued, he swiftly retreated to the ocean above, and with grateful hearts they followed him, glad to leave the cavern where they had endured so much anxiety and danger. End of chapter 19.